Right. Today I'll be talking about this topic, therapy changing trials in hemodynamics. This talk I gave in Narayana Hrudyalaya on 18th July 2019 in their hemodynamic workshop. And I've taken trials only from mid July to current date, to till date. So it's only 1 year practice changing trials, and I've taken only the trials. So no retrospective studies or any other study. I have taken 9 journal articles from late 2018 till date. So I've divided the trials into fluid trials. So there were three fluid trials that came in late 2018 and 19. One is refresh trial, which came from Australia. So RIFS trial, which came from US group, and there was one cardiac output trial, which came from Australia. Then this was an interesting study which came from an Indian from India. So it's a small study with the HAT study. So this is quite topical in this day and age, using hydrocortisone, vitamin C, and thiamine. So this was a small study in 27 patients, which came from a cardiac hospital. Then there were three blood pressure trials. So the one is the MAPAS trial, which came from Brazil. Then there was one trial looking at blood pressure in hepatorenal syndrome, and there was one study which came from Thailand in association with the US group. They did a sensor trial, so use of early vasopressors in septic shock. So I think last year when I gave a talk in Narayana, we spoke about Athos 2 trial where we spoke about angiotensin 2. So this time the new molecule in septic shock is anticholium. So this study came from Germany, and this is an important study, which is a paramedic 2 study, which came from UK group. So looking at the role of adrenaline or epinephrine in out of hospital cardiac arrest, and take home message. So we'll talk about the refresh trial. So this came in intensive care medicine. So study done in Australia. So the aim of this study was to compare the use of restrictive fluid with early vasopressors as compared to the usual care in patients with septic shock during initial resuscitation. So this was a prospective randomized controlled trial, recruiting patients within 6 hours. When systolic, they included patients whose systolic blood pressure was less than 100 millimeter mercury, even after receiving 1000 ml of fluid bolus. So the primary outcome was to look at the quantity of fluid that they received within 6 hours. So if you look at the difference between the restrictive arm and the usual arm, there was one caveat. In restrictive fluid, in addition to 1000 ml, they give pre-randomization. They continue to give maintenance fluid at 150 ml per hour, and in usual care, they are written as maintenance fluid if required. So I believe this is a little bit of a caveat, because if it is restrictive, I wonder why one would have given this maintenance. So that remains a caveat. Keep in back of mind. So they recruited 99 patients. 55 were in the restrictive group, 49 were in the usual group. So the median volume of fluids that restrictive got was 2387, 32 to 39 ml per kg. Usual group got 3000 ml. So that was statistically significant. And when you look at the vasopressors, the median duration of vasopressors, although it was little less, it was not statistically significant between the restrictive group and the usual group. And the 90-day mortality, there was no difference between the groups. So in the discussions, if you look at the fluid difference between the restrictive and the usual care, it's only 30% reduction of fluid in the restrictive group, which amounts to less than 1 liter. Cumulatively, it amounts to less than 1 liter. So whether we could say that this less than 1 liter is clinically meaningful, we do not know, because there's only 1 liter difference between restrictive and usual group in a randomized control trial, and whether that you could expect it to have some difference in outcome is something that one could question. And the limitation of this study is overall mortality in the sepsis group was only 7%, which is way below what is the actual mortality of sepsis worldwide. And they compared this study with when you compare this with classic study which came in 2016 by the Denmark group. This was the first study comparing restrictive and the usual care in the recent times, where they showed that the restrictive fluid arm, there was a reduction of acute kidney injury in the fluid sparing regime. um, so, so in comparison to this, I think they did not find this similarity here. So I think we have clearly understood that giving more fluids causes sequestration of fluid in multiple organs, leading to organ dysfunction. And the same sort of analogy applies even in kidney, where if you give more fluid boluses or fluid resuscitation, the sequestration of fluids causing acute kidney injury. I think that may be one of the understanding why AKI was less in restrictive as opposed to the liberal group. So the conclusions of this refresh study was that the authors conclude that restrictive fluid resuscitation along with vasopressors is feasible in sepsis patients, and when the illness severity is moderate, one could consider restrictive fluid resuscitation, and mortality could be could not be affected, or mortality could be low. In fact, although it was not statistically significant, they do suggest that this is something one could consider. So following this refresh trial, I think the US group came out with the RIFT study. This came in July 2019. I think this is a much better study than the refresh study. So this was a prospective randomized controlled trial. This came in critical care medicine. So it was done in two hospitals between November 16 to February 2018. So this recruited 109 patients, 55 in the restrictive group and 54 in the usual group. In the restrictive group, the target was the group has to get less than or equal to 60 ml per kg in first 72 hours, compared to the usual group, which could get how much ever that was needed. So the median fluid that the restrictive was within 72 hours was 47.1 ml per kg, and the usual group got 61.1 ml per kg, and that was statistically significant. So they looked at 30-day mortality. There was no difference between the restrictive group and the usual group. When they looked at new organ failure, serious adverse events, and ICU and hospital length of stay, there was no difference between the restrictive and usual. So the study says that restrictive fluid is non-inferior to the usual group, but what they significantly found was the duration of mechanical ventilation. So 32 patients were mechanically ventilated out of 109. Duration of mechanical ventilation was significantly less in restrictive. So this again indicates, like classic trial where it showed restrictive fluid reduces the risk of AKI, here possibly you could argue that restrictive fluid reduced the fluid sequestration in the lungs and reduced sort of acute lung injury. That's why the need for ventilation was much lesser. So it was 16.8 hours versus 33.6 hours, and that was statistically significant. So the conclusions the authors made was the restrictive regime led to reduction of fluid administration, and there was no increase in mortality, organ failure, or serious adverse events. And it did show reduction in the duration of mechanical ventilation. So in the discussion, so this trial was not powered to mortality. So the authors do conclude that it was not powered to mortality. So there's a new trial that is undergoing, which is powered to mortality, which is a Clovers trial. So we need to wait for this trial to conclusively say whether restrictive fluid resuscitation leads to better outcome. So in the restrictive fluid, as we have already noted, they received 47.1 ml per kg and usual got 61. So they compared this with the big mega trials that came challenging EGDT, which is the reverse trial, which was the old one, Promise, Arise, and Process. So they found it was 2 to 3 fold less than what these trials received. So in this RIFT study, the fluid they received was 2 to 3 fold less than reverse, because reverse received 168 ml per kg in comparison to 47 to 60 ml. And when you look at Process study, they received 108 to 130 ml per kg in first 72 hours when you compare to the RIFT trial, which has 47 to 61 ml per kg. And Promise trial got 98 ml per kg, and Arise got 108 to 109 ml per kg. So as you see, these big trials which compared or which challenged the early goal directed therapy received significantly more fluid than this RIFT trial. But what authors further went on to see what they used to ordinarily give fluid resuscitation prior to the beginning of the study. They did a pre-study analysis in 374 patients prior to this study. So they, in retrospect, they analyzed the patients, and they saw as their routine practice, as their routine care management, they were getting 75.5 ml per kg as a median dose in first 72 hours, which means after the study began, the fluid resuscitation even in the usual group significantly had come down. So they attributed this to something called Hawthorne effect. So because they were undergoing this trial, So there was a tendency to give less fluids in both arms. So that's what this would say. But still 75.5 would be significantly less when compared to all these previous landmark trials. So the basic thing I want to sensitize to the listener is, so there is a trend towards giving lesser fluid, and there is a emphasis on fluid having a significant bearing on the outcome, and fluid has to be given as a prescription, and one should be very cautious in determining how much fluid patients would get. So as I said, so the RIFT trial, when they compared with classic trial, which was a Denmark study which showed reduction in AKI, RIFT study, as you see, they have given lesser fluid than classic fluid. So what we are seeing is every study you are seeing the resuscitation with lesser fluid with no worse outcomes or with a similar outcomes than the usual care. So that is what I want to sensitize the listeners to. And if the question in the last study, reference study, I said whether the 1000 ml is it meaningful? Yes, it is meaningful. That came from this study from Semler, where they said a difference of 1000 ml did show reduction in death and decay. This study came in NEJM in 2018 comparing your balanced solution with crystalloids, and they found even 1000 ml of difference can make a difference, in death and acute kidney injury. So it is important. So what this whole two studies re-emphasize is, even there is not much room for even 1000 ml of extra fluid in a patient, which can have a bearing on negative outcome. So I think this is where we are heading. And limitation of this study is there is no blinding. So this is the Kaplan-Meier curve, and if you see, this is a graphical representation of all these ARISE, PROCESS, and PROMISE study, where all these big circles represent those. These small tiny circles is what was the fluid given in RIFT study. Okay. So let's move on to the third study, which is again a cardiac output and fluid study, which came from Australian group in 2019, published in Journal of Intensive Care. So the hypothesis for this study is to see, by using this cardiac output, so they used EV1000 volume view cardiac output monitor with a thermodilution, where you get a stroke volume variation and cardiac output. Whether by using this fancy tool of cardiac output, whether it had any bearing on fluid resuscitation. So it was a single center randomized controlled trial. Primary outcome is to look at difference in the daily fluid administration between the patients who were monitored with cardiac output and the patients who were not having cardiac output, and to look at the cumulative fluid at the end of 72 hours. So 80 patients were recruited, 37 patients were connected to cardiac output monitor, which is EV1000 flow view, volume view, and 43 patients were in standard who did not have a cardiac output. So if you look at the cumulative fluid balance, so there was no difference between the groups. Ordinarily, you would expect someone who is connected to cardiac output, they should have received less fluids, because you had more information to determine your fluid resuscitation. But that was not the case. The cumulative fluid balance was the same, and the daily fluid administration also same between the cardiac output and standard group, and adverse events in the cardiac output group was nil. But what is important is, only 43% of the time cardiac output information was used to make decisions about fluid resuscitation. So that is something you need to pay attention to. So the conclusions the authors made was, randomized control trial with cardiac output to determine fluid resuscitation is feasible, and this study showed that cardiac output did not have any bearing on minimizing the fluid resuscitation. So, then the question, the innate question that should arise in everyone's mind is, why is it that cardiac output did not help in minimizing the fluids? And then the authors looked into why they gave fluids in patients who were on cardiac output. Because they gave fluids as a reflex response when there was a hypotension in 46%, and they gave fluids when there was increasing vasopressors in 31%. So we have clearly understood, when there is an increasing vasopressors, it not necessarily means that there is fluid deficit. It does not indicate that it is hypovolemia. Rather, it may be an indication of worsening clinical condition. That's what we need to understand. And the urine output and blood pressures were considered as a target for ongoing fluid resuscitation, where this study from Australia in 2015 clearly showed that blood pressure cannot be used as a target for your ongoing fluid resuscitation, and that has a limited role. So there was another interesting study which came from Netherlands, Ramu et al. So they looked at passive leg raising test and your fluid responsiveness. When they did in sepsis patients, they found that 75% of the patients were not fluid responsive when they did passive leg raising. But what they found in an observation is 54% of them who were not fluid responsiveness, which was determined by passive leg raising, ended up getting fluids, which means physicians are overruling what is indicated by cardiac output or what is indicated by the current evidence or current understanding of a passive leg raising, still giving fluids when urine output low or when blood pressure falls or when vasopressor is increased. So it is more of a behavioral change that we should be convinced with the cardiac output tools or with the hemodynamic tools we use and be guided by it rather than overruling it and giving it when blood pressure is going down or urine output is coming down. I think that is what is the point that authors try to make here. The strength of the study is it's a large sample com- comparing cardiac output and no cardiac output, and both types of shocks were used in this patient, septic and cardiogenic shock. So we finished the fluid trials, which is the refresh, riffs, and the cardiac output. So now we'll move to this HAT study rather. So which is a which is very topical in this day and age after the Merrick study. So this came by the Indian group. So hydrocortisone, vitamin C, and thiamine, and looking at its effect on mortality and vasopressors. So this study was done in patients undergoing cardiac surgery with septic shock. So this because this study came from a cardiac hospital, so it was predominantly done in patients undergoing cardiac surgery with septic shock. So the primary endpoint is vasopressor dose at 4 days. Secondary endpoint was hospital mortality. So they took, it's a very less number of patients, 24 patients. So the group which received hydrocortisone, ascorbic acid, and thiamine, they received it for 4 days compared to placebo. They looked at the vasopressin dose. It was lower in the HAT group compared to the placebo. Norepinephrine dose also was lower in HAT group. And day 3 PCT they measured, which was low in HAT group as compared to the placebo group. And SOFA and mortality, there was no difference. So the conclusions the author made was that this HAT or hydrocortisone, ascorbic acid, and thiamine in patients with septic shock who have undergone cardiac surgery did not reduce the vasopressor need for the patient. So after this, we need to ponder whether there is any science at all in this ascorbic acid or vitamin C and thiamine. Does it have any scientific bearing on how it can help in our sepsis? So if you look into the physiological aspect, so vitamin C acts as a cofactor for dopamine B hydroxylase, which causes conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine. So basically your vitamin C is increasing your endogenous norepinephrine levels, which is useful in patients with sepsis or septic shock because your endogenous norepinephrine is much higher and it may mitigate the shock. And reduction of what we have found is in critically ill septic patients, vitamin C is very grossly depleted. So there's depletion of vitamin C leads to depletion of endogenous norepinephrine. And vitamin C is known to scavenge free oxygen radicals. And it is known to restore good sort of a chemicals within the cells like tetrahydrobiotin and alpha tocopherol. And it increases the tight junction. And this is important because vitamin C is shown in animal models to increase the tight junctions which maintain the endothelial integrity in the vascular endothelium. And we know for sure in sepsis or septic shock there is increased capillary leak because of gaps that exist within the vascular endothelium. So because of increase in the tight junction, it preserves the vascular endothelial integrity and it enhances the function of lymphocytes and macrophages. And but so these are some of the functions of vitamin C. One could convince, yes, it may have some role in improving the shock and reducing your vasopressors. But why thiamine? So why thiamine? Because we give high doses of vitamin C, up to 6 grams in the study. So they have found high doses of vitamin C can lead to oxalate deposition within the kidneys. And why that deposition happens? Because the glyoxylate is reduced to oxalate Ordinarily, you want glyoxylate to be oxidized to carbon dioxide, and this oxidation happens in the presence of glyoxylate amino. So in presence of this GAT, so glyoxylate amino transferase, and thiamine pyrophosphate acts as a cofactor for this reaction. So you want thiamine to be present for this oxidation to happen, leading to carbon dioxide production, and this is mediated by glyoxylate amyl transferase. Okay. So because of this, basically to reduce the or mitigate this oxalate crystal deposition, we thiamine is needed. That's why we would supplement with thiamine. So I think there are about 6 to 7 trials that are happening with vitamin C. So I think it is sort of a equipoise at this point of time. So we have done a study within our center. So we have recruited around 100 to 110 patients. So we are analyzing the data. So we will be coming out with our results. So what is expected is there is a multicentric trial which is happening in US called the Victus trial. So we would be waiting to see the findings of this trial, and maybe I will be looking into our own hospital study and see whether this really holds promise in sepsis and septic shock. So that's about the HAT study. So now we'll move to the blood pressure trials. So this is a MAPA study. This came from the Brazilian group in April 2019, published in Neurocritical Care. So our whole controversy is whether we should reduce blood pressure in patients with ischemic stroke. So this study was looked at to see the optimal systolic blood pressure in patients with ischemic stroke who is not thrombolized, and see whether it has any effect. I think our whole understanding is in patients with ischemic stroke, they need higher perfusion pressure to salvage this yellow area which is ischemic penumbra. So if we reduce the blood pressure, our understanding is this penumbra which is viable, ordinarily viable, may become non-viable because of the ischemia. So, the study was to look at manipulation of this blood pressure by vasopressors and fluids, and see what blood pressure is favorable in patients with ischemic stroke who have not undergone thrombolysis. So randomization happened within 12 hours, and good outcome was moderate Rankin score of 0 to 2 at 90 days. So they had recruited 218 patients. Group 1, they divided into 3 groups. Group 1 were managed with blood pressure between 140 to 160. Group 2, 161 to 180. Group 3, 181 to 200. So the median systolic blood pressure in each group, in first group it was 153, 163, and that was statistically significant. They looked at good outcome. Good outcome is good neurological outcome, modified Rankin score of 0 to 2. They found when they looked at good outcome, there was no difference statistically, as you see. But when they did logistic regression, removing all the confounders, so they found that the good outcome was found in group 2, where the blood pressure was maintained between 160 to 180, and the odds of good outcome was 2.83. And alongst with it, concurrently what they found is the occurrence of symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage was much higher in group 3, where blood pressure was maintained at 180 to 200 range, which was 9.1%, and that was statistically significant. And they found this group 2 and group 3 to maintain blood pressure in this range, norepinephrine was used in group 2 to group 3, and that was statistically significant. And they looked at in what group did good outcome happen. So good outcome happened where blood pressure was increased in 47%, which means to maintain in a group where they had to use vasopressors and fluids to improve the blood pressure, good outcome happened in 47. And good outcome happened in 42% of the patients where blood pressure was reduced with antihypertensives to maintain in one of these groups, and 62% where it was not manipulated, good outcome happened, but that was not statistically significant. So now the whole question remains, so what is the ideal blood pressure? So we need to look at the previous trials. So the whole concept of this blood pressure came with these trials which looked at reduction of blood pressure in the ischemic trial. The CHIPS trial came from the UK group, where they showed early reduction of blood pressure improved outcome. So that's where the whole question rises as to should we reduce blood pressure. When then the CATIS study came, this came from the Chinese group, where they found the blood pressure reduction within 48 hours did not have any benefit on the neurological outcome. Then I think the conclusive sort of a stand came from this Cochrane review, which was a meta-analysis of 26 studies, including 17,011 patients. And this is the biggest sort of a systematic review where they found reduction of blood pressure did not lead to improvement of, there was absolutely no improvement in the functional outcome. So that's why, so we have sort of understood that reduction of fluids will not, I mean, reduction of blood pressure may not lead to good functional outcome. So this was the SCAST trial, which came from the Norway group, where they found reduction of blood pressure, in fact, led to the progression of stroke and led to progression of carotid artery stenosis. So if you look at all the trials, looking at Cochrane review, meta-analysis, and looking at the CATISH trial and SCAST trial, the reduction of blood pressure did not improve the outcome. So limitations of this study is it's a single center, it's a small single center study, underpowered, small sample size. And what they interestingly found is only 30 to 40% of the time blood pressure was not in the target range, where they divided three groups. 30 to 40% of the time they could not maintain blood pressure in the target range, which means only 60% of the time they were in the target range. So that was one of the limitations. So the conclusions the author made is there was, when you compare between these three groups, good outcome at 90 days, it was no different. However, when they did logistic regression, removing all the confounders, they found good outcome in blood pressure of 160 to 180. And another thing they found is if you maintain a higher blood pressure, 180 to 200, the risk of symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage was high. So we can, if you vouch for this study, we can sort of conclude 160 to 180 may be better in ischemic stroke who are not thrombolyzed. So let's move to the another blood pressure trial, hepatorenal syndrome. So this particular study came in August 2019, which is yet to be published as a hard article, and this came in Journal of Critical Care from the US group. So hepatorenal syndrome is a complication which we see in cirrhosis with acute kidney injury. Annual incidence is 7.1%, prevalence is 13.45. But what is important is the mortality is very high. It goes from 20 to 80%. So there are studies comparing which is better in hepatorenal syndrome, norepinephrine or terlipressin. So these are the two studies which came, one from US group, from Brazil group, where they showed there's no difference between terli. You can use either of them for hepatorenal syndrome. And this was a study which came from Denmark, where they showed in hepatorenal syndrome, if you use vasopressor early, it was shown to reduce mortality by 18%. So that's the hypothesis or the background for this study. And this is the quality indicator. Acute Dialysis Quality Initiative said in patients with hepatorenal syndrome, one needs to maintain MAP or 10 millimeter more than the baseline for 4 days. You have to increase the MAP to 10 millimeter from the baseline to improve the outcomes. So this study was done to see whether this truly holds good. Okay. So this was a prospective randomized control trial done in 18 patients. So one group was maintained with MAP more than or equal to 85. The other control group was maintained with MAP of 65 to 70. They looked at day 4 urine output. There was no difference between higher MAP and normal MAP group. And they looked at the delta change between day 4 urine output and day 1. So there was no difference between high MAP and normal MAP. They looked at the delta change between day 4 and day 1 serum creatinine, where you would have expected improvement in serum creatinine in higher MAP, but that was not the case. There was no difference between these two groups. And mortality also was no different between these two groups. So limitation of this study was there was no blinding, it was underpowered. And even here in this study, the target MAP, high MAP, if it has to be more than, only 48% of the time they could maintain high MAP. 48% of the whole duration they could maintain. And even low MAP, only 27% of that, which means we know for sure that blood pressure is very dynamic and it is very difficult to manage blood pressure in this narrow range for 100% of the time. So that's what they found. That was the limitations. The conclusions they made from this study was in hepatorenal syndrome, whether you maintain high MAP or normal MAP of 65 to 70, there is no difference. Okay. Okay, so let's look at this innovative molecule. So here they have used a molecule which is easily available and fairly cheap, effect of physostigmine on recovery from septic shock following intra-abdominal infection. And this came from the German group published in Journal of Critical Care. So the whole physiological basis of this is when there is a sepsis or septic shock, there is a vagus stimulation. So there is inflammatory vagus stimulation which leads to activation of parasympathetic nervous system. So, and this parasympathetic nervous system activation leads to cytokine storm or production of increased cytokines and causes release of tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin. And this whole activation, this inflammatory stimulus to the vagus nerve, leading to activation of parasympathetic nervous system, leading to production of cytokines, TNF alpha, is mediated by this receptors called alpha 7N acetylcholine receptor, which is present on the macrophage. So the whole hypothesis is to look at the role of physostigmine salicylate treatment in suppressing this parasympathetic nervous system activation of inflammation, release of cytokines, and inhibition of release of these factors. So the primary outcome was to look at the mean SOFA scores during the treatment and up to 14 days. 20 patients were treated. So the dose of physostigmine they used is 0.04 milligram per kg as a bolus, followed by 1 milligram per hour for 5 days they used. So they recruited 20 patients, 10 in the physostigmine group and placebo group. Mean SOFA, there was no difference between two groups. Norepinephrine dosage, there was no difference between physostigmine and placebo group. They looked at vasopressor and mechanical ventilation free days. There was no difference between physostigmine and placebo group. Adverse events were mild to moderate in physostigmine, and these adverse effects were not attributable to physostigmine per se, and there was no serious adverse events. So the conclusions they made was that the treatment with this innovative molecule physostigmine salicylate in sepsis and septic shock is feasible, and they found from the study that it is safe, and the authors do conclude that further larger randomized controlled trials could possibly be done with this physostigmine to see if it has any benefit in mitigating the septic shock. I think that is an interesting, and because we know physostigmine is not very expensive, I think one could undertake this study. So this is the SENSOR trial. So this is early use of norepinephrine in septic shock resuscitation, a randomized trial which came in May 2019 from Thailand. So the Thai investigators along with US investigators did this study, published in American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. Aim of this study was to look at role of early norepinephrine and to see if it improved shock control in 6 hours. It was a single center double blind randomized controlled trial. Primary outcome was to look at the shock control by using norepinephrine. So the shock control was defined as maintaining MAP more than or equal to 65 or having urine output more than or equal to 0.5 ml per kg per hour for 2 hours, or reduction in lactate more than or equal to 10% in 6 hours. So these were the definitions of shock control in this SENSOR trial. And the background of this study is there are two studies where they showed that the use of early norepinephrine, one came from Australian group and one came from Chinese group, where they found early use of norepinephrine had a good favorable effect on reducing the mortality, because I think the whole concept is use restrictive fluids, use early vasopressors rather than keeping on giving them filling and only when they are non-responsive to start norepinephrine. I think that concept is slowly fading away. If you recall your refresh trial, RIF study and this early vasopressor use. So they recruited 320 patients, 155 in the early norepinephrine, 155 in standard group. So the median duration for getting early norepinephrine was 93 minutes. So in the other group, it took around 3 to 3.5 hours for getting norepinephrine. That was statistically significant. If you look at shock control within 6 hours, shock control is maintaining MAP more than 65, urine output more than 0.5 ml or lactate clearance. It was much better in early norepinephrine group, 76 compared to the standard, which was statistically significant. 28-day mortality, there was no difference between the early norepinephrine and standard group. What they interestingly found was pulmonary edema was less where early norepinephrine was used. Maybe you could say that hemodynamic optimization was achieved early, that prevented from going into other hemodynamic or respiratory compromise. That was statistically significant. And what they also interestingly found was the arrhythmias was less when they used norepinephrine early, again to show that hemodynamic optimization early prevented them from slipping into pulmonary edema or arrhythmia, and both were statistically significant. So limitations of this study was they could not mask. I think there was no masking of norepinephrine effect because they couldn't mask that, there was no blinding, and it was not powered for mortality. It was a single center study. The conclusion from the sensor study was early norepinephrine improved shock control in 6 hours. So I think as we see from all these recent trials in last 1 year, maybe use less fluids, don't wait, maybe concurrently start off early vasopressors, don't wait until you see a response with fluids. So start fluid resuscitation and maybe concurrently starting early norepinephrine may lead to our better outcome. So this is the last study I'll be talking about, very important study, Paramedic 2 study, which came in NEJM in 2018, and this was a study done by UK group looking at a role of epinephrine in out of hospital cardiac arrest. So this was a double blind randomized controlled trial. Primary outcome was to look at 30 days survival. Secondary outcome was to look at favorable neurological outcome, which was defined as modified Rankin score less than or equal to 3. So this was a big study, 8,014 patients recruited, 4,015 in epinephrine group, 3,999 in the placebo group. They looked at 30-day survival. As you see, survival was much better in epinephrine group as compared to the placebo, statistically significant. When they looked at good neurological outcome, there was no difference between the epinephrine and placebo group. And when they looked at poor neurological outcome, the survivors where epinephrine was used, because there were more survivors in epinephrine, the poor neurological outcome was more in that group, 39 versus 16, that was statistically significant. So the conclusions the authors made was in out of hospital cardiac arrest patients, if you use epinephrine, it would improve the 30-day survival, but these survivors had poor neurological outcome. So they had severe neurological impairments. So yes, by giving adrenaline, by authorizing paramedics to give on-site adrenaline may make them alive, but would not lead to good functional outcome because they had a severe neurological impairment. And when they looked at favorable neurological recovery between the epinephrine and the placebo, there was no difference. So this is a useful trial where one, if survival is your endpoint, maybe we should think of authorizing our ambulance paramedics to administer adrenaline at the site of cardiac arrest. So the discussions for this, I think the authors made was they compared with the previous trials. So this was a Canadian study, meta-analysis of 6 randomized controlled trial, including 6,174, comparing between low dose adrenaline and high dose adrenaline. They found there was no difference in survival and favorable neurological recovery. There was no difference. So either you use 1 mg epinephrine or 5 to 10 high dose. There was no difference in survival, no difference in neurological recovery. But what they found is return of spontaneous circulation was better when high dose adrenaline was used. And this was another PACA trial which came prior to this paramedic trial in 2011. So it is pre-hospital adrenaline in cardiac arrest trial which came from Australian group. So this trial was undertaken to compare epinephrine versus placebo, but this trial was inconclusive as only around 10% of the patients they could recruit because recruitment was a problem in this study. And in this particular study, paramedic, they found the number needed to treat was 112. So 112 patients who were administered adrenaline out of hospital, you could prevent one death. So NNT number needed to treat was 112 to prevent one death. So the take home message, as I said, there is a move towards giving lesser fluids because we have believed giving more fluid leads to sequestration of fluid into multiple organs causing organ compartment syndrome. So even it has been found giving more, there are at least around 10 to 12 trials in last 1 or 2 years that have come highlighting the deleterious effects of giving more fluids because we have got to recognize hepatic compartment syndrome, renal compartment syndrome, or brain compartment syndrome, or worsening of brain edema by giving more fluids. So there is a move towards giving less fluids. So that refresh trial shows that you can do a trial by giving restrictive fluid with vasopressors is feasible in septic shock. And RIFS trial clearly shows that restrictive regime leads to lesser fluid administration and with no increase in the mortality, organ failure, or serious adverse events. Then we had this cardiac output trial where they said even using these fancy monitors with all the stroke volume, with all the indices, did not lead to lower fluid administration. The HAT study showed, it's a small study from Indian group, which showed that HAT did have a bearing on reduction of vasopressor usage. And MAPAS trial, the blood pressure trial, showed between the three arms of blood pressure, there was no difference. But with logistic regression, I think 160 to 180 as a target for ischemic stroke who are not thrombolized may be better, and maintaining 180 to 200 may lead to symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage. And in hepatorenal syndrome, high MAP and low MAP, there is no difference. And physostigmine is innovative, so it's a cheaper molecule. So the authors do conclude that there could be a larger trial that one could do with physostigmine in sepsis and septic shock. Sensor trial, which came from Thailand, shows again reiterates that early use of norepinephrine may be beneficial in sepsis septic shock rather than waiting to see a response to the fluid allocords. Paramedic 2 trial, out of hospital cardiac arrest, epinephrine has a survival benefit, but these survivors were left with more neurological impairment. So thank you very much. So find your balance. So go through the study and ascertain what sort of studies would you apply in the practice. And do visit my website. So if you want to rehear this lecture, please visit this website. There are around 40 to 45 videos that are uploaded, and these uploads would continue to increase, and it would be useful for all the trainees, and share with all your friends. Thank you very much.